Life in Full Flight by Pamela Nicholson. My early memories of childhood growing up in the 1930s bring thoughts of drama and excitement. With the Second World War in full action, life seemed surreal in hindsight. From a child's point of view, you don't fully understand the dangers, fears or devastation and lifelong impact that comes with war. I had two uncles who were pilots during the war, and the news of their real-life drama always made interesting dinner table conversation. I was a little older when my Uncle Frank was shot down and taken as a POW by the Japanese. By this stage, I started to understand how frightening it all was. Later, I remember seeing photographs in the paper of those poor, emaciated POWs. I felt shocked at how such strong, important men could become so vulnerable. Heroes I felt so strongly about. War finished, and my desire to fly was insatiable. All I wanted to do was fly. In those days, it wasn't really mainstream for girls to become pilots. Anyway, my father wouldn't have allowed it, and after all, women weren't supposed to have a brain. Plus, in such a man's world, I would have been considered a lesbian. At 17 years old, I was too young to join the airline as an air hostess, so I decided to fib about my age and give it a shot anyway. Besides, I was desperate to move out of home. My mother, at the age of 40, had just given birth to her third child. And, to tell you the truth, I was a little embarrassed that she did that. I mean, what was she thinking at that age? I applied to ANA, Australian National Airways, as a hostess and got in. ANA was the only airline operating in all states back then. My adventure begins. It was very different back then. People didn't fly around like they do now. It was considered very daring. It was commonplace when in uniform for people to stop you in the street and comment on how brave you were and what was it like up there with no oxygen. Questions from little old ladies such as, "Are you really going to be there in Brisbane by lunchtime?" At this time, it took 12 hours to fly from Adelaide to Perth in the old DC-3 and 7.5 hours in a DC-4. Very speedy. These were the days when it was quite costly to fly, a bit more special. Our job was to make every passenger feel important by talking to them individually and listening to their possible concerns about flying, and reassuring them, and nothing more. Remember, people were scared of flying as it was still so new for the everyday person. I was stationed interstate for the first couple of years. My first experience of living away from home, sharing a house full of other girls. It was incredible. The friendships, the sharing of the clothes, the laughter. It was like having instant sisters that I always wanted. These days formed lifelong bonds that are pure gold. Unbeknown to me at the time, I met my future husband during this period, but he was going out with another lass at the time, but this comes later. I was having far too much fun flying to take much notice of him. The pilots were mostly cheeky, and the flirting was endless amongst some, and innocent mostly. There was this one trick they would always play on the new girls. They'd put the plane on George, autopilot, then call the hostess to the cockpit for something, then hide. This always freaked out the new girls and never failed to leave the pilots in hysterics. Such little boys. Film star Ava Gardner was on one of the flights one time. Not mine, but gee, did we hear about it and talk about it. She was filming that famous movie On the Beach. Ava was the epitome of glamour and style, and it would have been an honour to be on her flight. Big Hollywood movie star of the day. Turns out she was so rude and demanding to the crew on that flight that I don't think anyone from ANA ever wanted to see her films ever again from that day on. The one thing I've carried with me all my life is the time that a fellow hostie was scheduled to fly on the Amana, one of the lovely Aboriginal named planes. She swapped flights with another hostess for the return flight, and it went down, killing all passengers and crew. This was a very low point for everyone. We were such a tight-knit family. Shortly after this, I was forced to give up flying due to an ear problem. Anyway, in those days, you would have to give up flying the minute you had a ring on that finger, which wasn't all that far off for me. Memories are wonderful things and can stay quite clearly, sometimes for a lifetime. I have a very clear memory of a regular flight from Adelaide to Perth in the faithful old DC-3. With a 7 a.m. departure, we stopped at Ceduna, Forest, Kalgoorlie, and Perth approximately 12 hours later. It was usually a long, hot and bumpy day of flying, as we had to fly low due to the lack of oxygen. Our stop at Forest around lunchtime was unforgettable. The population was mainly Aboriginal railway workers, maybe 20 or 30 living in small corrugated iron huts adjoining a low-slung building containing a large kitchen, presided over by buxom Mrs. Clem, who daily cooked a hot roast meal for the workers and our crew of 3 when we stopped there. She would wait at the bottom of the aircraft steps until any passengers disembarked and cheerily insist we hasten to the kitchen for our hot roast potatoes. Not always our favourite lunch in temperatures of Fahrenheit 115 degrees plus, accompanied by extremely large blowflies. One day, the ritual lunch over, we boarded our aircraft and closed the door. Captain in his left-hand seat, first officer outside, using all his strength to turn the prop, while the captain tried to ignite the reluctant electrical starter. By now, we found we had quite a local gathering, ignoring the roast dinner for the DC-3 floor show. There was more to come. A truck was driven over, stopping under the left-hand engine so that the first officer could stand up high enough in the tray to reach the prop. Another local helped race over with a long piece of thick rope, which he gave to the first officer, who now began to manually wind the rope around the front of the prop and pull with all his might. With brakes on tight and engines at full throttle and the prop spinning fast, the captain shot off, taxiing speedily down the runway, leaving the first officer behind. Over the bumps and potholes, he taxied about 100 yards, then pulled a swift U-turn to speed back up the runway to pick up the first officer, barely stopping. I'm sure it's the fastest he ever had to move to catch an aircraft. Finished flying, fell in love, 2 children, a business, and 25 years of marriage, followed by the abrupt whiplash of a divorce, brings me up to now. I'm now retired and napping a lot these days. I still have my weekly conversations with my flying girlfriends, and we so often gravitate to the subject of the good old flying days, opening the hangar doors, so to speak. The get-togethers are fewer these days, but whenever we do, it seems like yesterday. I live with wonderful memories. Life's really worth living.
Well, I was pushed into it by my daughter, really. I kept putting it off. But when it was finished, I thought, well, that was quite good. I've never written anything in my life before except a letter. So I really am not qualified to give advice to anyone. Off the top of my head, in a way, I didn't realise I was really writing something to go into publication.
Excellent.